Vahe contacted me some weeks ago about an event he and his friends had put together in Berlin and invited me to attend. The event was called Sudanahye, which means Sudanese Armenian, from colonial histories to solidarities across Armenian and Sudanese diasporas. The event was a fascinating combination of Sudanese and Armenian ethnic groupings all joined together to share their own experiences of life in Sudan. The freedom to express certain insider thoughts were encapsulated by the nervous laughter that followed and how everyone else responded with their own laughter. That warm magnetism imbued the atmosphere in such a rare state of empathy that it felt as though diversity was coming together as it should always come together. This podcast follows that event and refers to some of what was discussed there to serve as an opportunity for people to hear what Vahe and Sudanahye is about and to see just what it means to the Sudanese community too. Thank you, Vahe, for taking the time to talk with me and also for meeting me last week to talk more about your project. I look forward to following your progress and wish you every success. This is Two and a Mic. Rise up and be curious.
Dung weche pek kod welo mabiro e Two and a Mic. Dung parodit kod jok mawuoye Two and a Mic. Seche tin sud buta wawinji e Two and a Mic. Ola wachokre wabed piny biwawinje ero chako momit ndi Two and a Mic podcast makende.
I'm joined by Vahe from London. Rather interesting, even though I have Vahe Amsterdam saved in my phone. How's it going, Vahe?
Yeah, good. I have your new saves as soccer Berlin, and maybe there might be basketball in there as well, because I don't know if you remember. we reconnected because soccer is an old London community veteran, I guess. I'm sorry, old is not a nice word to use.
No, man, that's cool. Hey, I'm surprised that I've reached the age of 48. So yeah, no, it's all good. It's all good.
Well, you didn't look 48 when we reconnected on the basketball court in Mauer Park, and yeah, it was all very well synced up, and you're a great team player. So glad that that's continued, and we're here today.
Thank you. Yeah, it's always nice to get these wonderful compliments to put us in the positive mood for the discussion that lies ahead. It's actually interesting as well, because we reconnected a couple of years ago at what diasporan Armenians of a certain persuasion call the First Republic. So it's after the end of the First World War, and gathering together the remnants of the Armenians from where they lived in what is now Eastern Turkey, but what was Greater Armenia, the consequences of the genocide and so on. And they built the First Republic. And at this celebration 2 years ago, we kind of reconnected because, I mean, as you mentioned, there's a bit of there are a few years between us, as in I've sat in meetings with your father, and we know each other very well. And you I've obviously been aware of, but we never really sat down to have a conversation because our ages just didn't really allow us to do that. And yet 2 years ago, that kind of happened in the bar. And that's where I kind of got to know you a bit more. And you said that you occasionally came to Berlin, and you also told me about this great Cafe Arakil, which is a cafe with a very socialist profile, which interested both of us. I'm talking a lot like this because these things kind of led to my developing awareness of who you are in a more meaningful fashion. And then later on, people will be able to kind of connect the dots when we talk about Sudanahye and so on. But yeah, so your relationship with, let's start with your relationship with your project, because it's called Sudanahye, but I always associated you with the Iraqi Armenians. because half of my family is also Iraqi Armenian. Do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, I think Iraqi Armenians all over the world are known as quite, especially in the diaspora, are known as quite active people. And there's a number of reasons for that, at least in my head, but we're not going to get into that today. But the Sudanahye thing, yeah. So Sudanahye is the Sudanese Armenian Heritage Project, and this started. I mean, it started formally this year in January of 2025, but the idea came about in April 2023 when the war in Sudan started. Because when the war in Sudan started, a lot of my family on my mother's side are Sudanahye, actually all of them. And I remember speaking to family members about the situation there, what's going on. And everyone was so upset. People were saying, like, this person's left, this person's still there, this house, this church, that. And it was really sad times. And at the time, I was working in crisis management. And unfortunately, because Sudan is not really a country that's kind of relevant in the global economic system in a big way, it didn't really change anything. Like, no one really, it was just like, yeah, cool, there's war in Sudan. To an extent, in the West, there was this perception of like, oh, isn't that the place that's always in war? Anyway, so once all of this happened, I kind of started thinking, hang on, what can I do? And I figured, well, at least the least I can do is speak to the elder members of my family whose stories risk getting lost to time. And so I just started speaking to them, and one thing led to another. And they told me, you should speak to this person as well. He's got a great memory. This person has great stories. Oh, this person was really important in the community. So it kind of expanded a little bit just in an oral history way. And then with the support of the Carlos Gulbenkian Foundation, who gave me a grant, this became the Sudanese Armenian Heritage Project. And again, at first it had like a relatively small scope, because I remember looking at the sources and like Googling stuff and being like, okay, cool, there's not really that much information to be had, and there's not really that much history we can do, because I studied history at university, so I have a decent idea of how to kind of do historical research. At first I thought it wouldn't be enough to study, but over the past year, basically every door I've opened has led to like another room with lots of doors and windows. And the Sudanese Armenian community has been so helpful. Like at this point, I'm not even doing that much in terms of outreach. People are coming to me, people are saying, hey, you should speak to this person. People are sending me their photos. So the community has kind of come together to create this project, this legacy for the community, because as you said about Iraqi Armenian heritage, it's well documented. There are books, there's a lot of things online. Iraqahais are very, not just like economically or politically active, but also culturally active. They pass down their stories, and there's still a community there today to also like anchor the legacy and the history in Baghdad. Sudan doesn't have that. And with the war, that risks being lost forever, because the final Armenians left Khartoum. Whether they return or not is a question mark. And without this project, it would have been a big loss of Armenian heritage. But one thing I'm also always emphasizing is that there'll be a loss of Sudanese heritage. And I'm sure we'll get into that later based on what we saw last week in Berlin. But for me, I think Armenian history, with reasons, can often be quite insular. And we kind of put these walls around us and say, hey, we're Armenian and we like live in our little club and we live in our little community and we do us. Whereas in reality, it just takes an observation of all the different diaspora communities to see how influenced we are by those places. That, you know, Iranian Armenians have Iranian Armenian culture. Iraqi Armenians have some Iraqi culture. Sudanese Armenians have some Sudanese culture. But rather than putting up these walls and saying this is us, I think it should be the opposite. And we put down those walls and say, hey, this is our history, but it's also your history. And it says something about your country and there's something about our country. And the response from the Sudani communities has been insane. Like, I really wasn't expecting so many people to really cherish the story of the Sudanese Armenian community as something valuable to their kind of national heritage.
A great introduction into what is Sudanahye. And as you say, we'll come into more detailed discussions about the event that you hosted last week in Berlin, and also your collaboration partners for the event, and also for the photo exhibition that is ongoing in Berlin as well. There's an interesting question about identity. So a question that I've always had growing up, and I still have today, is that when people kind of, I sit down with, or I used to sit down with my schoolmates. Okay, so where are your parents from? And they say, yeah, okay, my mum's from London, my dad's from, I don't know, Basingstoke, just to add an element of mystery to their family. And they were born in Ealing, for example. And then the same question would be asked of me, and I'd say, okay, well, my mum was born in Baghdad in Iraq. My dad was born in Beirut, and I'm born in London, but we're Armenian. And people could never really understand that, because for them, these kinds of combinations simply didn't really exist, as they weren't really names which had any kind of meaning for them. And so later on, when immigration started to kick in from the Middle East, as opposed to simply from Commonwealth countries and so on, there were more issues that were being raised, more realities that were being discussed, and more recognition of some of these different areas, rather than simply being places on a map, which there was no meaningful characterization for them which they could grasp. How was it for you? Because you probably had some similar identity issues that you not necessarily had problems with, but did you find it difficult trying to tell other people who you were?
Yeah, it's funny you asked this, because I remember, I mean, maybe it's changed now. I hope it's changed now. But I remember in school when I was quite young, people being like, "Oh, you're born in England, and therefore you're half English." And I was like, I don't really think that's how genetics works. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people wish it was, but that's not. I think a lot of us diasporan Armenians in the multicultural West, I should say, have this kind of identity crisis because of exactly what you said. We're already members of what you might call like a double diaspora, which is, okay, you're Armenian, and then you add in the Middle East thing, then you add in the London thing, and then in those places, in somewhere like Lebanon or Sudan or Iraq, it's like you're Armenian and you might be Lebanese, but you are like, the Armenian thing is separate. Like, I think the Middle East has a different form of multiculturalism, because ultimately the Middle East has been multicultural for millennia. Europe hasn't. Like, the British only really lived with others when they were ruling over them. They never really had people living all together. Okay, yeah, there was some small pockets of multiculturalism in London, but generally they weren't. There wasn't even religious tolerance up until the Enlightenment, almost, maybe a bit later. So I think that there is definitely this question around identity in the diaspora. I think in my case, it was, I'm not going to sit here and give a sob story and be like, oh, my life is so hard, because obviously growing up in London is a massive privilege. And you do get education, you do get this, you do get that. But there's a reality of, people come here because we were there. Our families most likely learn English, and then we're like, oh, where am I going to go? England. And, back then, I don't know if it's still the same now. I feel like not, because nowadays people are like, I want to move to Canada or Germany. But I feel like in the 70s and 80s, everyone was like, wow, Britain, like, that's the place I want to go to. So to come back to the point, I think it was weird because also both those countries were places that, A, you can't go. Like, growing up in the 2000s, I mean, Iraq was already in war. Sudan wasn't necessarily doing great. So can't go, won't go. Whereas a lot of other people who, growing up in UK, they're like, oh yeah, I'm going back to my country for summer. And they're like, oh, they go back to, I don't know, Albania, they go back to Romania, they go back to wherever they might be from. And I was like, well, I can't really go back. And then it doesn't help when you go to school and if people ask where you're from and you say Iraq or Sudan, they'll be like, oh yeah, it's the country's in war. And obviously back then people would make pretty bad jokes about terrorism and all that kind of stuff. But then I guess the other element to add into this is Armenia as a country, which is, once Armenia became independent in 1991, diasporans, including, I guess, my own family, we started visiting there and being like, okay, cool, our countries are in this situation and this condition, but there is a country of Armenia where we could in theory belong. So we start going there. But then it's weird because it's like, you're not really going home for summer, you're just going to Armenia for summer. And like, people be like, oh, you're seeing your family, you're going family village. And it's like, no, I don't really have any of those. So I think diasporan Armenians, and again, especially in like the multicultural West, we do kind of exist in this identity crisis, but that identity crisis is us. And I think the more, because it's a multicultural society, because we're told to integrate and assimilate, and we're not kind of given our, like, I know it sounds bad, but in Middle East, it's kind of like separate but equal. It's like you are separate community, but you're equal to everyone else. Whereas in the West, it's like kind of everyone mixed in. So within that, we do live these identity crises, and I've seen, interestingly enough, I feel like everyone kind of goes through their own path. And for some, they go down a route of discovery. Some people go down a route of avoidance. Some people go down a route of like, I don't know, picking like a weird thing to be into. But generally, I think this identity crisis we kind of exist within is what makes us, Armenian diasporans, us in the modern day.
Yeah, I mean, I always was quite able to compartmentalize. So when I was at school or doing things with non-Armenians, I was Zach, and had the persona that Zach carried. So I had certain interests, I had certain limited abilities in whatever sports I was participating in and so on. And then in the Armenian community, I was Sako, and I had specific interests and I had sort of specific responsibilities, which I kind of had to live up to. And expectations, I think, was also something which kind of molded the person who I was in the Armenian community. But there was very little mixture of my different compartments, as in I carried the same interests into both worlds. And yet it didn't really create an issue for me. I think some of the issues for me were kind of created by my perception of how others viewed me and whether or not that actually influenced my comfort levels with the person that they identified me with being. And at no point was I ever overwhelmed, as it were. And I'm not sure if that corresponds to everybody's understanding of their own identity.
But were you ever able to bring that duality together? Like, because I'll give you an example. I also have that. I have in England, I'm Vahe. And in the Armenian world, I'm Vahe. Vahe is a good, responsible human who does community stuff, and Vahe likes playing basketball, going for a drink. But interestingly enough, through the project, I kind of brought those two worlds together, where suddenly I find myself introducing myself to people in a circle and be like, I don't know what to say, because it's like I am Vahe, I am Sudanahye, talking about Armenian stuff, but then I'm saying it to people who aren't Armenian, or I'm saying it in a circle where like one person knows me as Vahe, one person knows me as Vahe. So I found the project kind of brought those two worlds together. But was there any moment like that for you where you kind of brought that duality together?
I'm not sure that I've engaged in such a topic. What I feel as though I've put everything that I have learned from the Armenian community, from my work there, from dealing with different kinds of people, into what I do today. So when I teach, or when I do workshops, or when I create content, I put all of that into what I'm now doing. When people ask me questions, though, such as the one that you've asked, and whatever other things that may interest them, I just answer it as transparently as I can. My way of, I don't actually have a consideration of an identity crisis. I just have me, and I could only give my perspective. And when other people give me their perspectives or their criticisms, or they feel that I should behave in a certain way and so on, I just say nowadays, okay, I take that on board. Thank you very much. But I just leave it pretty much as it is. I've never had a problem with who I am. And nowadays, I'm just happy to also talk to people who are genuinely interested in who I am and what thoughts I may have. But I haven't really created what you've created, which is that vehicle in which you can explore all of those elements further. I mean, I have this podcast, but I think I had done about 100 episodes before I even ventured into Armenian topics. So it didn't formulate the key element of what I'm doing on this podcast. Whereas with Sudanahye, straight away you've married these two spheres of who you are.
Yeah, and I think that's something for me that's been really, really great. I also feel like I married these two spheres together last year when I went to, I guess, maybe you want to call it historic Armenia, because that was kind of like for me, kind of bringing these dualities together. Is like Vahe is going to the land where Vahe is, I guess, indigenous to, and I managed to bring those two worlds together. Also, it helped that I read a lot of literature and kind of remembered that like it's not that deep. Like I'm not alone in this. I think when you are doing this, navigating this kind of identity thing, quite often it can feel quite lonely, but in reality it's like there's loads of books, like loads of big thinkers, like people from Edward Said, Amin Malouf, they've written about identity and their own struggles living in foreignness. And the more you study history, the more you realize in a way, like life is movement. Like you can go back as far as you want and find people have always migrated and moved. And whilst Armenians in some cases feel like a kind of OG diaspora, where, you know, especially now we're living in a very multicultural world with more migration, more globalization, more wars, more refugees. Armenians have been doing this for a time, and I always say, like, the countries we were refugees in the countries where refugees are now from. Like that's how I guess sometimes I frame it when people, especially when Armenians get high and mighty about our status and like, oh, we're so incredible. It's like, hey, we were refugees in those countries that you're now saying this, that, the other about. So yeah, bringing together that duality was an interesting point. But I also think maybe it's a generational thing as well. Like obviously, and I don't know when it changed. I don't know if it was like I changed or like the world changed, but I feel like when I was growing up in the 2000s, being ethnic wasn't cool. You know, everyone wanted, I don't know, like I feel like everyone wanted straight hair and everyone wanted like English names. And now, again, I don't know if it's me or if I'm just older, but now it feels like being ethnic is in, and like suddenly, like, you know, even, you know, for the aesthetic as well, like suddenly on British TV, you start to see, I don't know, Jem from Love Island, and you know he's not English. Suddenly you start seeing Kim Kardashian. It's like she's not, you know, white American. So even the aesthetic kind of changed around what looks good and what doesn't. Because before, in the early 2000s, it was like, oh, you know, Paris Hilton. And anyway, I'm not an expert in fashion aesthetics, but I do actually always find myself asking the question of like, did ethnic become cool? Because even if you go back to, you know, in the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the cool kids of, you know, I guess the cool rich kids, the hipsters, the Prenzlauer kids, where they would dress as Huns. They would like try and do like barbarian fashions with their hair and stuff, because I guess it was their rebellion. And in a weird way, oppression has always kind of led itself to fashion. And we also see this in America with the Black community and the gay community, and whether you want to do house music, hip hop, whatever. So I go off topic a little bit here, but yeah, I don't know if ethnic became cool or if it was just me changing.
Yeah, I mean, culture is something which is always changing, and as much as people try to say that we need to protect our culture and defend our culture, that's kind of like a very ignorant view of history, and also an ignorant view of their own culture. And in the UK, for example, people always talk about St. George, and it's very rare that they actually realize that St. George is probably from a part of the world which they would never recognize. We use numbers which are of Indian, Arabian origin, and a lot of people don't understand the history of development, the history of learning, education, and of course how much our cultures have been simply intermeshed over time with so many other cultures. But what's also a point that I was hoping that you'd get to, and I was referring to earlier. So you mentioned that you went to what used to be Greater Armenia. When we first met a couple of years ago, I believe that's when you were about to engage on that trip, or maybe you'd had some experiences there before anyway. And I thought that's extremely brave for you to undertake that challenge. And that's when I started also following you on social media. And then after that is when this new project and movement of yours, of Sudanahye, came about. And that kind of took me by surprise a little bit, a very pleasant surprise, I have to say. But can you tell me a little bit about your initial trip then to what used to be Armenia?
Yeah, it took me by surprise a little bit as well, because I actually thought my like project and cultural work was going to be on this trip. And you know, I'm not the first person to do it. Like people have been doing it for decades now, even older. People have been going back and finding the lost homeland. I think what made my trip special was that I have a Cypriot or Turkish Cypriot best friend who came with me, because I think quite often what happens, and I even studied it before going, is like there's this book called House in the Homeland, and it speaks about like the tour bus, because what often happens is Armenians go from Armenia and the tour bus goes to, you know, Turkey. And understandable, like I was also looking at doing that a couple of years ago, but what happens is the tour bus kind of becomes like a safe Armenian space, and you go in the tour bus, you get out, you look at something, cry, dance, whatever it is people do as their rituals, and then you get back in the tour bus and you move on. But by going with my friend, being able to, who actually speaks Turkish, and by just being like us two on this kind of like, I don't know, I guess Anatolian motorcycle diaries type thing, we were able to actually really engage with not just the history, but like the current politics as well. As in the same places where you might go and look at something that used to be Armenian is now the battle for today. Like in Diyarbakir, like a quarter of the old city was destroyed in recent conflicts, and that's also where Armenian stuff is. And if you're not careful, you might forget all this recent stuff and all the recent struggles, and just look at the old. But to walk you through the trip, so I spent a week in Istanbul. Fortunately, due to some friends and friends of friends, I was able to have like a full Armenian tour, and that was insane because, you know, we always think of like Armenia as, you know, okay, where like the Armenian riches are, but in reality, a city like Tbilisi or a city like Istanbul has actually a way richer Armenian heritage in terms of like buildings, architecture, cultural history, just rich people who've invested in things and put their name down on things than many places you would traditionally consider Armenian. So I thought Istanbul was incredible from like an Armenian point of view, and a lot of work has been done. Obviously, the struggle still continues for Armenian heritage there, but a lot of work has been done, a lot of research has been done that lets you engage with the history yourself. I mean, Hrant Dink Foundation released an app called Kardes, which does like multicultural self-guided tours of Istanbul, which is really incredible. And despite the issues in Turkey, to quote someone, an Turkish Armenian I spoke to, he said like we live in it. Like all the stuff you guys talk about, we're inside that problem or this like dynamic. So despite them being in it, there's still like a really rich Armenian community there. They have schools, hospitals, newspapers in different languages, cultural events, Armenian areas. And I don't know if you've had this, maybe, I don't know if you've been to Beirut or wherever you have been, but I think from us from London, it's quite nice to just be somewhere which it does feel actually Armenian, because we don't have like an everyday Armenian school. So when they took me to one, I think the Karagosian school, I was like, wow, what a beautiful building. Oh my God, incredible. There's like Armenian teachers. Wow, this person's like an Armenian dance expert. And then they were like, why are you so excited? Like, it's just a school. And I was like, I've never been inside an Armenian school, like an everyday Armenian school. It feels like a kind of safe sanctuary and everything. And then after Istanbul, we went to Diyarbakir, which again, there's an Armenian, Surp Giragos Armenian church has been renovated. They actually even have little rooms you can stay in on the side. Beautiful. Diyarbakir itself is beautiful. The people are really beautiful, very curious, very, Diyarbakir is kind of like, I guess, the Kurdish cultural capital. People were very open-minded and really curious. Everyone had a story about something Armenian, whether it be like this place you should go to, or my grandfather, or this or that. Diyarbakir is really beautiful. Amazing food. I mean, that was all over the place, to be honest. And then we went towards Gars, and then kind of looped back around through Van, and then back to Diyarbakir with some different stops on the way. Each place felt very beautiful. Each place felt very different. And I think that speaks to the really thousands of years history that exists in that area. You know, there's a lot of mountains in between places. Like Gars had a more Russian vibe in terms of architecture. Van felt a bit more cosmopolitan. I think since some earthquakes, things have been destroyed, things have been renewed. Beautiful nature around there. If you go to the south towards Mardin, if you understand that this was like the Assyrian homeland, and there's a lot more churches. It's really beautiful history as well. It's also strange because you kind of see the cultural appropriation done by Turks. There's like Turkish tourists from Istanbul coming and, you know, putting on like what they consider a Kurdish headscarf, and they get braids. I'm like, how is braids Kurdish? Like, it's just like anything like exotic, and then they take like photos and photo shoots outside Armenian and Assyrian churches without knowing the history. So that's quite strange to see. And then the journey continued towards into Dersim, which generally kind of avoids Armenian tourism or heritage tourism, I'll say, because it's quite remote, but has an incredibly rich history, not just of like hidden Armenians, but of like Armenian history going back 1,000 years in Dersim, and obviously in the modern era as well. Dersim has a history of being a thorn in Turkey's side, and then continuing on to Urfa and Antep, where you kind of feel that you're not necessarily in the mountains anymore, and what might be like the original indigenous Armenian highlands, but you're in cities. And in Antep, there's really beautiful Armenian architecture. And Urfa as well, like a city that has thousands of years of history. It was an incredible trip. I could speak about it for hours, so let me stop there. But for Armenians who are thinking of going, even non-Armenians, it's a beautiful place to do tourism. But for Armenians who are thinking of going, I would say go. I've traveled, I've had the privilege of traveling a fair bit before, but usually travels are like you go somewhere, you sit in the sun, you have a nice time, maybe you have like a nice fort on the beach or something. This was like a deep emotional experience, and the more you get into the history, the more it kind of allows you to bring all this jigsaw puzzle together. And the resources are there. Like there's amazing resources like Husham Madian. There's amazing books out there like Richard Hovhannissian's collections that will really allow you to do your research before going, so that when you do go, everything kind of comes to life. And it's sad, like it's not going to be a purely happy experience, but the path to happiness is not always fun. So
the number of places that you mentioned, the geographical differences between these places kind of speaks volumes to the mass of culture that had developed over the centuries, over the thousands of years within the Armenian cultural space, but also, as you mentioned, Kurdish space, Assyrian space. It also speaks of the sheer horror and size of the genocidal efforts to rid the entire region of Armenians. And it was a really interesting connecting point for me listening to last week's talk, because you mentioned within the internal issues that Sudan was experiencing as a colonial entity itself, or having become a colonial entity through the colonialization of Egypt under the British, that at this point, even though there were already Armenians living in Sudan, because they considered Sudan to be a welcoming and friendly place for them to go, but this reputation continued even after the genocide. So when the Armenians were kind of being forced out, ethnically cleansed, if those obviously survived the genocide, thereafter, so many went to Sudan. And this combination of different phases of history kind of really struck quite a nerve with me. I thought it was fascinating. Do you want to talk a little bit about that then? So the pre-genocide community, as it were, in Sudan, and then also post.
Yeah. I think this is my kind of proudest thing from the research, because understanding the history of the past 60, 70 years to an extent is something we can do through oral histories. Obviously, it'd be great to have different sources to kind of corroborate and to kind of add color to the history, but we are able to find it out. I can go and call my grandma and be like, hey, do you remember this? But the old history was really a mystery. And what you quite often see in Armenian history books, because there's a couple that do mention Sudan, is they all kind of refer to the same source, and they aren't necessarily that critical about the sources. Like they won't be like, okay, cool, this person wrote this, and maybe he has these biases, or he comes from this lens, or he's a priest, so he's going to see things in this way. They kind of just like say what happened, which I understand, because there's so much that happened in Armenian history. When I was studying history at university, sometimes it felt like they were just reinventing the wheel, because it's like, well, there's, they have this topic, and rather than going deep into different topics, they just go around a million approaches on the same topic. In terms of the history of the pre-genocide Armenians in Sudan, it's interesting. There's two ways I've kind of been able to illuminate the story. One is through Yaqub Artin Pasha. There's going to be soon 3 blogs about him on the Sudanahye website. He was an Egyptian Armenian bureaucrat. He traveled to Sudan in 1908, I think, and he wrote about his travels. And there's a whole angle of on the website about him, which is basically like him as like, basically a Western adjacent and everything that fits into that. I won't comment on that, but I do think you should check him out on the website, because again, I am critical of sources. I do look at the worldview they had and the lens that he comes with. But he does basically interact with Sudan's earliest Armenians. And some of those went with the British in 1899 when the British conquered, because wherever there was British, there was money to be made, and the British were willing to do certain things and weren't willing to do certain things. And some of the things they weren't willing to do was, they were willing to govern. With everything else, they were willing to make money. Are they willing to go and learn Arabic and speak to a Sudanese person and be in the market, or deal with Sudanese people day to day, like laborers, farmers, traders? Not really. No, the British were rulers, and whilst in other colonies that kind of had a different experience, because for example, when the British were ruling America and they have their own their own colonizers there and their own settlers, they don't necessarily mind getting into the nitty-gritty of day-to-day life. But in somewhere like Sudan, where they did have this very racist view towards the Sudanese, they didn't want to mix with them. generally. So in the pre-genocide, before 1915, you have a small community of Armenian, mostly merchants, who moved to Sudan in search of, I guess, fortune. At this point, it was quite common for Armenians to leave the indigenous highlands to travel to work, and that's how you see the earliest communities ranging from, America, Argentina, Europe, Bulgaria, Istanbul, Middle East. Egypt was one of these as well, where basically Armenians moved there, and we have evidence of these Armenians coming together, putting their money together, and sending money back, whether that be to fix a church, whether that be for their families, and so on and so forth. So we have this early community of mostly merchants. And then in 1911, AGBU, Armenian General Benevolent Union, opens a branch in Sudan for exactly this purpose, to kind of get everyone to pool their money together. Whilst AGBU might not necessarily be that interesting, what is the HBU archives in Cairo, which are fascinating, and they've done an amazing job at preserving it. And they gave me access to it, which I really appreciate. The HBU archives in Cairo has a lot of their letters from 1911, including member lists, including, correspondence with Cairo, correspondence within Sudan. And with that, we're able to illuminate the story of the early Armenian community. And again, before the genocide, it was mostly merchants doing their thing, spread out geographically all over the country. And then after the genocide, in 1918, we see a couple shifts in the community. Number one is demographically, you get an influx of Armenians, people telling their family members to come join, Armenians adopting people, refugees arriving. And these Armenians who arrive aren't necessarily the daring trader types that might have come before. These Armenians that arrive are refugees. They kind of have no choice. And they come with a different skill set. Whereas before it might have been, I'm a merchant and can speak multiple languages. People who came afterwards are, I'm a hairdresser, I make cheese, I do basturma. And we see this in the data as well, in the archives. The other shift that happens is within the HBU archive, we see this kind of dichotomy between those who want to continue to fundraise and raise money for Armenian causes and the relief of the, at that time, catastrophic Armenian humanitarian situation in the Middle East. And you see other people who are like, no, we should start to invest in the community. We are in Sudan, we're Sudanese Armenians. Whereas before, people were saying, oh yeah, cool, I'm going to go back to my homeland one day and meet my family and be super rich and it'll be all great. At this point, things are shifting and people are saying, no, there is no homeland left. We should invest in a community center. We should invest in a school. We should invest in a club. And you see this kind of conflict play out in the HBU archives between some members who say, no, we should be raising money for the previous stuff, and some members saying we should be doing the new things. And it's funny because at one point, I think there's a letter from an old community member who was born in the old country. And he says like, yeah, the youth of today, and this is in the 30s. He's like, yeah, the youth of today don't have their heads screwed on properly. They don't know what they're doing. And, it's our fault for not raising their generation properly. And when I read this, I was like, there's literally every generation ever says this. So when you hear that from older people, don't worry, you're not alone. Every generation has this. So yeah, after the genocide, you see this kind of entrenchment. And at least through the exhibition and stuff, we tried to, the Curious exhibition was curated by Fatma Saleh, our archivist in Cairo. You see this journey of belonging. So whereas in 1910 or at the beginning of this period in 1899, it was just, I'm an Armenian working in Sudan, making money in this like British colonial enterprise where there's like a little gap and a country that has a lot of resources that the British are trying to exploit. And we can kind of be the middle person in that. By 1956, as Sudanese independence, you see the Armenian community as a fully like entrenched part of like Sudanese high society, but Sudanese high society is like fabric. I don't know if this is the same in other countries' diaspora histories. I haven't gone that deep. I know for a fact my family in Iraq, for a long time, they used to cheers at New Year's and say, next year we'll be back in Van, back in the homeland. So I know that might have been a concept, but I don't know if the same entrenchment took place over the course of 40, 50 years where people said like, no, I am now Sudanese Armenian and we are in Sudan and this is part of our identity now.
Yeah, I can't speak as to that particular perspective shift. My dad's mum, who was born in Beirut, she was called Lipanuhi. And that suggests to me a perspective of staying in Lebanon, or at least a kind of dedication to Lebanon for having granted so many Armenians the opportunity to stay in that country and to live in freedom and peace. What I found to be really many things actually. So fascinating about the story that you pick up about Armenians in Sudan. It was also the Sudanese perspective, because I really appreciate that you're not only looking at things from the Armenian perspective. And when we spoke privately in Berlin as well last week, there is this tendency that Armenians have, and I think it's not just an Armenian thing, every perhaps nation's representative does it. They kind of look at things from their own countries or their own communities' perspective, and they don't necessarily try to engage in the interrelationships that may exist between the different communities and the different kinds of views, the different visions, the different thoughts, feelings that may develop from further interaction, whether that is on a personal level, whether that's on a business level, or whether it's purely cultural and, you know, people sort of passing by each other in the street and how they may spontaneously consider one another. And I think you do that really well, especially the space that you want to share. You don't want to give, you want to share space with people of Sudanese heritage, and sharing that as a person with Sudanese Armenian heritage. And I find that to be fascinating for, you know, maybe reasons that we'll talk about later on. How did you generate these relationships with the Sudanese community? Was it easy for you to do that? How was the reception?
It's a great question. And I think the prerequisite, there's a couple of things we should probably discuss here, because as said earlier, the historian always comes with their own worldview. Whilst many historians say like I'm neutral, the reality is, for example, for me, I'm a historian now. I'm born in whatever year I'm born in, and I grew up in London, and studying history in London, there is this history of empire, there is this history of multiculturalism. If I'd grown up in Beirut in the Armenian area, the chances are I'll probably also be like, yeah, this is Armenian history. I don't need to bother with someone else. So I understand that every historian comes with their own set of values. Another thing to bring in here is the stories that the Sudanahye told me when I was growing up. Whilst, yes, there was this Armenian community that was, you know, in the same way as many Armenian communities in the Middle East, quite isolated, because the Armenian community was nowhere near as big as other places, there was a lot of mixing with different people, whether that be other, you know, Greek, Italian, Jewish communities, or whether that be with Sudanese middle classes and upper classes, in a way that I don't necessarily think that other communities always had. So those two things brought together, when I started the project, I was like, this needs to be something that is an angle that's looked at. And add to that, that the project was, one of the reasons the project was started was the conflict in Sudan. Whilst if you're doing history of another Armenian community, you might be like, no, we need to preserve the Armenian thing because everyone else is safe, right? Like, you know, if you're studying Armenians in China, you're not going to think, oh yeah, I need to do something for Chinese cultural heritage because then they're not going anywhere. Like, China's safe and there's 1 billion Chinese people, and then the Chinese cultural heritage is extremely well funded and researched. In the Sudanese case, it's like, this is, again, part of Sudan's history, and Sudan's history is also at risk. There is this battle for history going on in Sudan, whether that be looting the museums all the way through to kind of this rewriting of Sudanese history as in a way that includes more about the tribal angle in the past 50, 60 years and more. And I'm not the expert in the Sudanese side of the history thing, so I won't necessarily go so deep into that. In terms of how I connected, my family always told me growing up that Sudanese people were so hospitable, so kind, so helpful. And that's what made part of the nostalgia that the Armenians exist in, of like when they say like, oh, those were the days. And I get emails always saying like, those were the days, and you know, what great days we lived. We never thought they would end. The reason that was the case is because Sudan was in some way such a serene place for people to live. And that kind of reflected itself on the project as well. Of once the Instagram started once the wheels started turning on the Instagram and there was a bit of content out there, I received so many messages of support from Sudanese people being like, this is incredible. I think as Armenians, we can also understand that quite often we feel forgotten. So when someone comes in with like a new angle on Armenian history, a lot of us might be like, hey, this is incredible. Like, you actually care, you actually listen. And it was the same, you know, with Sudanese people. Quite often it's the narrative of war, genocide. It is quite often forgotten in the, at least modern Western lens. And this Armenian angle is something different, it's something fresh, but also it speaks to people's own memories. There's a lot of the older Sudanese community who are, you know, maybe 50, 60 years old, and they literally remember, they'll be like, I have Armenian friends, like this Like they came to the exhibition and they'll be like, I know this person. So because of the social media kind of gathering strength, a lot of people reached out to me, and this allowed us to make these links. And then, for example, in Berlin last week, it was the perfect environment to have some of the more difficult conversations, which is throughout the project, and some of the Armenians have alluded to this, some of them haven't, there is this reality that because of the kind of position, because of the British colonial enterprise, the Armenians did get quite wealthy. And with wealth comes a certain class, and the Armenians were middle and upper class generally, at least in the decades up until, I guess, the last 20 or 30 years. And in Berlin, we were able to have the conversations kind of contextualizing the Armenian history within Sudanese conversations around class, but also race and identity. And they're not easy conversations to have. I understand why a lot of Armenian historians will want to swerve clear of these. But fortunately, because of my background, having grown up in London, within multicultural societies, with friends from all over the world, you have these conversations from a younger age. So you know how to navigate the realities of like, okay, cool, there are Armenians in Sudan and they felt this way about Sudan, but they also got wealthy within this colonial system and then continued that wealth. I personally don't like ignoring elements of history. I try to integrate everything in, because I think within like a mature setting where people are well informed, and that's not always something you can find, but in somewhere like Berlin, we were able to find out. Like, you know, we collaborated with Sudan Uprising. I was on the panel with Ibrahim, who was extremely well informed. Like, I learned more myself than maybe anyone in the crowd. And I love being able to receive a question, give the Armenian angle on it, or give the take of like, this is what I've learned about that event or that person based on the people I've spoken to, but then pass it over to Ibrahim and be like, Ibrahim, you know, what's the Sudanese take on this? And that was really beautiful. And I did really enjoy doing that. And I think it's very important. And I kind of hope that more Armenian history does that. Because as you say, this networks and these flows in a way, this is something becoming kind of a trend in history where rather than looking at things within the national lens, people are starting to look more at transnational flows, especially in history where the nation state is a relatively new concept. Like for the past 200 years or a bit older, we start to see everything through a national lens. But again, the history of the Middle East is something that kind of transcends nationalism. Whilst Sudan is a nation state inherited from the British as one country, someone said at the talk last Monday that Sudan is actually like a multinational state.
It's great that you, as I said, you shared the opportunity, the evening with Ibrahim from Sudan Uprising, and I also learned a lot from that experience. And I loved seeing the photograph because of the more recent episodes that I've had talking with people from different African nations, so Nigeria and Kenya in particular, but talking also about Burkina Faso, Mali, and what's happening in these areas. I had a more African, as it were, perspective. And I loved seeing the photos that you had up there, because whenever, in general, I've seen images of these olden times, of African people, of the interactions between Europeans and people of African origin, the roles that have been played out in those photographs have been either as the Europeans were missionaries, they were people in authority, and there was no direct interaction between them and the African people who were in the photograph, as in they more or less had separate views or had separate positions within the photograph. There was one who was the dominant character in that photograph, and then everybody else basically had to assume the role of being an underling of some form or another. But in almost all of the photographs that you showed with the Armenians interacting with Sudanese, they were having fun together. They were entertaining themselves together. They were communicating together. And it seemed to me to be on the same level. Is that how you would characterize the main relationships between the Armenian community in Sudan and their Sudanese counterparts?
It's a really interesting question. I'm still trying to find the answer myself, because, yeah, you're right. There are, in the photos I showed, there are loads of, like, you know, you see an Armenian basketball team playing a Sudanese basketball team. You see Armenians enjoying a social occasion with Sudanese. In the Armenian club, you'll see Sudanese generals there with Armenians. And even the stories in the later period, in the 70s and 80s, you know, at one point, Sharia law came in, and Nimeri famously poured alcohol into the Nile, and suddenly alcohol was banned. But lo and behold, in the Armenian club, you can still get alcohol. So Sudanese generals would, on the sly, come in. So you are right. Like there was a lot of social interactions. There's also the reality of, again, Armenians were in a different class. Like Khartoum in the early days didn't really have that many Sudanese living there unless they were servants or workers. It was mostly European communities and British. And Armenians did all have, mostly had servants. And this is something that's been quite interesting to tackle because, in London, if you tell someone like I have a servant at home or I have like a maid or an au pair or a cleaner, even a cleaner is like, wow, that's a big deal. Whereas in Sudan, this was relatively normalized. And throughout the entire Middle East, this is normalized, sometimes in very bad ways, as in there is like the whole problem with kafala and modern slavery that exists throughout the Middle East. But having someone working in your home is not as much of a class status symbol as it was in Europe. So there is that reality. But in terms of legally, I found no evidence that the Armenians were in any way above Sudanese or had any sort of advantage to them. And then, as you say, socially as well, there is this thing. And again, it makes sense because think about it. I said the British only lived with people in history generally if they lived above them and ruled them, or sometimes lived apart from them and just made their money. Armenians, we've always lived with others, like, whether we like to accept it or not. Again, it just takes a trip to Turkey now to see, like, okay, somewhere like Arabkir, where a lot of Armenians were from, the sources say the only way you could tell an Armenian apart from a Turk or Kurd was one goes to worship on Friday and one goes to worship on Sunday. We've always lived with others. And so it makes sense that when we go to somewhere like Sudan, yeah, okay, at first, and then we have in the sources the initial shock factor, the first time an Armenian sees someone black and they're like, oh, wow, but we have this ability to live with others. We have the ability to learn languages. It's the same reason we thrived in Egypt in the 1800s within the Egyptian bureaucracy, able to learn languages very quickly, able to live with others, able to navigate these different cultures. And in Sudan, we see that too, where we are refugees in Sudan. We do need to find a way to survive. Whilst some Armenians, for sure, held some of the same views as the British about Sudanese, in general, the Armenians aren't British. They don't have the same privileges. They can't run back to Britain. They didn't have British passports. They didn't get British passports. They were never given these. For example, somewhere like Cyprus, I think the Cypriots were able to travel to Britain. Most Armenians weren't. So within that, the Armenians kind of did socially mix with the Sudanese. And I'm not going to sit here and say the Armenians were socio-economically equal to the Sudanese, because I said they had a lot of opportunities the Sudanese never had on account of their identity, because the British were willing to trust a Christian Armenian more than a Sudanese. And it wasn't just the Armenians. I said the other immigrant communities also benefited from this. Even, for example, in the Sudanese bureaucracy, for a long time, the British were hiring Christians from Lebanon. At the time, the Syrian Protestant College, now the American University of Beirut, had a lot of doctors, and the British would take them and go serve in Sudan. The bureaucracy, the finding British people who want to work in Sudan was an interesting challenge for the Sudan political service. But for a long time, up until 1924, the bureaucracy was staffed by mostly Egyptians. And again, the British preferred Christian Egyptians than Muslim ones. So the British kind of did their own form of social engineering, and within that, the Armenians existed and survived. But we also had no horse in this race. For example, the Egyptians in Sudan, the reason they got removed from the bureaucracy is in 1924, when the White Flag League had their revolution. All of a sudden, the British were like, "Oh, this is a bit of a risk here that we have Egyptians," and suddenly the Sudanese might be getting these ideas of nationalism from the Egyptians. Whereas the Armenians, we have no horse in this race. We were just there because we had to be. So we didn't have our own agendas. It didn't make a difference to Armenians whether Sudan went in this direction or this direction. And you see this in the later period where Armenians from Sudan become, and it's the same in most of the Middle East as well, become extremely patriotic for their countries, their second countries, their host countries. Somewhere like Sudan, Armenians are extremely patriotic and really believed in wanting the best for Sudan, because again, there's no gain. Like, we're not the British, that we don't have a gain from doing social engineering and dividing and conquering and putting this person against this person. The Armenians only wanted to live wealthily is kind of, I guess, an Armenian motto at this point. Why? That's a different conversation. But yeah, the Armenians wanted to live, and that's what we did.
Yeah, a little anecdote about that is when I was, one of the occasions I was in Armenia, we were part of a conference and there were delegates from different parts of the world, and I remember when the Armenian delegates from the USA stood up to talk at this conference as a participating member, the Armenians from the Middle East gave a gentle sort of boo, because this was around the time of some of the USA's activities in the Middle East, which obviously had devastating consequences. So that kind of ties in with exactly what you're saying. So Armenians, after the genocide, or even before, in the case of some countries, but after the genocide, of which I'm more aware of, whenever they went to these countries, whether it was Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, Lebanon, wherever it may have been, they developed a genuine emotional connection with those countries. They wanted to participate in the growth, development, and success of those countries, not just for themselves, but also for the countries themselves. And I find that to be great. And it's something which we've obviously continued ourselves, growing up in the UK, growing up in Europe. I think all of the countries where Armenians have existed, they have genuinely tried to contribute to the society. And as we also spoke about last week when we were talking, so just in the Armenian Scouts, we mentioned that there is a fundamental principle of the Armenian scouting groups, that you have to try to be a model citizen of any country in which you live. And I feel that speaks very much of the need for Armenian communities not only to be accepted, but to also be active members of the society in which they live. That's obviously what was born out from what you found out, but also perhaps how you've grown up as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's how we survived. That's the OG diaspora. There is this idea of the Armenian diaspora being something that only existed since 1915. Okay, in Sudan it existed before. In somewhere like Egypt, it goes back to 1800s when Yusuf Bey moved to and then took people with him. But it goes back even further. When Ani was conquered in the 11th century or whatever, loads of Armenians left, and there was a massive community in Eastern Europe. A lot of Armenians went to Egypt at that point, like 1,000 years ago. Silesia itself, the Armenian kingdom of Silesia, is in a way like a diaspora state. So this history of Armenians and diaspora is not just a recent phenomenon. It goes back way older. And once you put that into context, then you start to realize that, oh, hang on, what does this actually mean? Like, how this is where like this long tradition of being a model citizen and respecting the country you're from comes from. And we have this tradition, we have this knowledge, we have this learning in a way. But I also think we're now entering a world which is more multicultural than ever, more globalized than ever. And Armenians have an opportunity not just to make profit, as well as people would say, be like, oh yeah, Armenians are good between the East and West, and we can do business with both. No, but we can also, we have lessons on how to kind of exist as a diaspora. At one point I remember complaining to someone being like, yeah, in London, the Armenian community, we don't have this, we don't have a school, we don't have this. And then someone was telling me, at least you have those. Like most communities don't have those. Like now that Sudan, the Sudanese communities are becoming a diaspora because of what's happening in Sudan in quite an entrenched way. They don't necessarily have schools. Sudanese kids in Egypt are starting to speak with Egyptian accents. And whilst we kind of, as soon as it hit, the genocide happened, we kind of had this idea, this model of Armenian community, which is there's a church and there's a school and there's an Armenian club, somewhere for culture, somewhere for language, and somewhere for faith, spirituality. That kind of trinity that exists within the Armenian diaspora is kind of what helped us survive. And most other nations or most other peoples don't necessarily have their way of doing that. And our method of doing that goes back 1,000 years. It's not new. So
another thing which captured me with the Sudanahye project and also the event was in itself the title. And there are two words which I'd like to draw from that. One was colonial and the other one is solidarity. I'm often asked, because I'm as much as can be a Pan-Africanist. I believe that there should be a united entity of African nations where they have the only right to determine what is best for all of their member states, and that there should not be any more, as there has been over the last few hundred years, direct domination and exploitation from external forces. And a lot of people that I've spoken with, they ask, look, why do you give a shit? Why do you care? And I say, well, look, I'm Armenian. We have, whether or not we all know, similarities, shared histories. There are elements where we have essentially had to fight against the same kinds of people. Those people may have different names. Those people may have slightly different shades of skin. But those kinds of ideas of nationalism, of extremism, of exploitation, of supremacy and superiority, of injustice, these are the things that me as an Armenian I have always been fighting against these things. And so I find it extremely easy to ally myself alongside all other peoples of any faith, of any culture, that is also fighting against injustice and exploitation. And when we had that meeting last week, and two Sudanese gentlemen came and sat next to me, and one of them stood up and was speaking about his own family history, and he mentioned how his grandfather was an Armenian who he converted from Christianity to Islam, and just lived with the people and found it extremely easy to thereafter become a member of that community. How do you see, through the work that you are doing, these kinds of shared interests of anti-colonialism, anti-exploitation, and solidarity being played out? And are these kind of fundamental principles of what you're trying to achieve?
This is a really great question. Maybe it's worth starting with a interesting comparison point, which is I had a debate. And again, this is why I love Berlin, because it's very politically conscious, and the people there are always going to be challenging your thoughts. And even me, I feel like sometimes people get like, oh, I don't want to get into a history debate with Vahe because he knows what he's talking about. But not in Berlin. And the conversation was around whether Armenia was in like a post-colonial state. Because on the one hand, like the Soviet Union wasn't a colonizer in the traditional sense. They made these Soviet socialist republics. On the other hand, the Soviet Union was clearly exploitative. It did benefit Russia more than it did the others. And there was this kind of Russian cultural superiority. And it only needs to go as far as the whole post-Soviet world speaks Russian. And I don't know about other post-Soviet states, but I know in Armenia still, like if you speak Russian, you can probably get things to move a little bit quicker than if you speak Western Armenian. So then the debate was whether Armenia was in this kind of post-colonial state, or and there was a bit of a debate around that. But then I guess the wider reflection on that is we've always lived under different empires. As I said, we found ways to survive and thrive within those systems, which is, if you look at when Armenians get very nationalist and proud about our achievements, like, oh, someone invented the first ATM machine, or, Armenians did this, or I don't know. Usually those things happened in diaspora, or those things happened under the reign of foreign empires. That's not to say like, oh, we're only good under foreign empires, which is what some people in Armenia say, by the way, being like, we should be Soviet again. That's insane. But there is a reality of we have always been oppressed in a certain way. And the nationalism of the oppressed is not the same as the nationalism of the oppressor. As much as this project is not trying to be something nationalistic, I also would not let someone who's British be like, oh, this is nationalist. Because it's like, hey, your nationalism means you go and take over the world and then tell people what's right and what's not. Our nationalism is just our means to survive as a cultural unit. Because if we don't do this, no one else will. Like, no one else is going to look out for Armenian history. No one else is going to do Armenian cultural stuff. No one's going to do that for us. It's on us. If we don't write our own story, no one else will. Or someone else will, and they'll twist it and write it in their way that helps their purposes. So I think within this broader context of oppression, and the more you read into Armenian history, it's sad. Obviously we speak about, like, I try and keep history lighthearted and happy because I want it to be interesting, especially for young people. But the reality is, when you're studying the Armenian community in Sudan and you hear about the genocide survivors and the way they were or the way they weren't, and smoked 60 cigarettes a day, never spoke about this, always wore black, didn't have family, everyone died in genocide. It's sad. And that's just the genocide. If you go back, there's different massacres in the 1800s. If you go back, there's different massacres all through Middle Ages. The loss of cultural heritage, even today, like what's happening in Artsakh, is sad. Like, Armenian history can be really sad. And I think rather than channeling that into, oh, we go sit in the church and someone played violins and I cried for an hour, I would rather channel that towards, like, no, it's sad, we were oppressed, but we can kind of overcome that. And if you want examples, okay, yeah, the Armenian situation isn't necessarily great today, yesterday, 100 years ago, but there's plenty of examples in the world, as you said, about the solidarity with Pan-African or different places in East Asia or even South America, where these were states that were colonized who have broken the chains. A lot of times have broken the psychological chains, because That's something that we kind of underestimate. And comparing the Sudanese and Armenian history is quite interesting because, as I said, like whether you want to put Armenia in a post-colonial lens or not is a different question. But Sudan clearly is. And Sudanese people are not in denial about that. They know that, yes, the British ruled us and the British saw themselves as above us, and the British dictated life in a way that we're still living with the legacies of that. That's not to say you're chained by them. That's not to say, I would not be happy if an Armenian person said like, oh yeah, our lives are like this and it's this person's fault and whatever. Like, no, our lives are like this and it's this person's fault, but you can overcome it. In the case of Sudan being like a multinational nation, like look at somewhere like Indonesia. Okay, the circumstances around it are different, but Indonesia is as ethnically and linguistically diverse as any other country, and they have found a way to come together over like a single idea. And whilst Indonesia also has the problems, and what they're doing in West Papua isn't nice, and so on and so forth, at the same time they have created a multinational state in like a post-colonial system. So all this to say, there are examples out there. So solidarity is on the one hand, like, yes, we should care because we, as you said, we have this experience. But on the other hand, we should also care because there's lessons to be learned. If we're going to kind of fix our own situation, the lessons are all there in our own history, yes, but also in other people's histories too.
I'll ask one final question, and you answer it in any way you wish to answer it. It's kind of difficult to lay down very specific directions. I think we also talked about it in some way last week when we met, that people will inevitably go through phases in their lives when they are more or less active in certain ways than in other ways. They want to pursue certain interests at certain times, which perhaps later on they may fall out of favor with, and so on. What kind of general direction, without necessarily laying down particular journey markers, what general direction would you like to take Sudanahye into? And what kind of reception would you like ideally to receive for the work that you're doing? Because you mentioned before that when in the early stages you were going out there and pursuing stories and trying to get information, now people themselves are sending you their own experiences and their own data and their own photographs and so on. What kind of reception would you like to continue in that way?
In terms of the first bit, the direction is forward chronologically. So I've been studying this via chronology. So now we've reached 1956. I need to do some writing and fully publish the history of Armenians in colonial Sudan. And also realizing that it's a bit sad, but I'm a bit of a perfectionist, but realizing that you're never going to close every window and every door. Like there is going to be some open, and that's okay. I think I have to accept that. So chronologically, to move forward, we want to keep on experimenting with the multimedia outputs. It's been really fun. For example, this podcast as well. It's fun. It's a great experience, and also every different output has like a different lens and a different angle. So I want to keep on experimenting with those. I think the wow factor, which is what initially led to the project having a big following of, wow, there's Armenians in Sudan. That's now been done. So I need to go away and think of like some new narratives and some new interesting stories and ways of presenting the information, because I don't think I'm going to get people being like, wow, there's Armenians in Sudan anymore. Because people will be like, actually, I think I receive messages sometimes from people being like, yeah, there's this really, I heard you're Sudanese Armenian. There's this guy studying Sudanese Armenians. You should check out his Instagram page. It's @Sudanahye.com. I'm like, yeah, that's me. Or like, I get Sudanese Armenian uncles like sending me my own articles being like, you should read this. I'm like, yeah, I wrote that. So I think there's that element of finding new angles. But in terms of reception, and this is an idea, again, this is why I loved the event last Monday, because I was learning so much and like so many ideas were flowing. I think, I can't remember which Sudanese person it was who said they should consider putting this as like something in the national curriculum of Sudan, so that Sudan in future, they learn about their own diverse history. Because as I said in the talk, whilst now there's this big question around tribes and regions and basically all the things that divide this country, and the country already split in two in 2011, the Armenian history doesn't see it like that. When you speak to Armenians about Sudanese, they don't say like, I spoke to a southerner, or I spoke to a northerner, or I spoke to someone from Darfur, or I spoke to a Christian or a Muslim. They say like, I spoke to a Sudanese person. Like, they see it as one country. So maybe the Armenian history of Sudan in terms of within Sudanese context can help that thinking. And on the Armenian side, I'll say in terms of like, again, in terms of curriculum, what I see is this massive divide between Armenians in Armenia and Armenians in diaspora. And I think a large part of that divide is an uneven understanding of history, which is Armenians in Armenia, quite often, a lot of them don't understand what it's like to live in diaspora. They think like, oh, you're sat in Los Angeles and you just got your legs up and the money is just flowing in, and then you come back to Armenia and buy whatever, how many shawarmas you want a night. And on the diaspora side, a lot of Armenians think like, oh, you've lived in Armenia for decades, how lovely it must be with like the fruits of our homeland and the water of our homeland and the mountains. And they don't know that, hey, like Stalin's Armenia was not an easy place to live. Like Soviet Armenia was not necessarily, you know, all roses. And in the 90s, there was no electricity, there was no water. Thousands of people have lost relatives in Artsakh. So I think this kind of divide between the understanding of diaspora and Armenia, at least from my angle, is something that maybe we can bridge with a joint understanding of history, a shared kind of curriculum in a way. And I think maybe the Sudanese Armenian history can be a small part of this, as like a interesting little, oh wow, there's Armenians in Sudan, I wonder what their lives were like. And as much as the Armenian story, as said, is a positive one and it has a lot of cool, fun, wow, Armenians lived a good life in Sudan, there's also the other side, which is, you know, Armenians also dealt with nationalizations. Armenians went there from genocide. Armenians lived in foreignness. Armenians lived in all over the place in Sudan, in places where I've read people complaining about like 40-degree heat and like diseases and all that kind of stuff. So by understanding the difficulties and the good things and the bad things about each other's history, maybe we can bridge some of those divides. So that's kind of what I hope the reception to be, but it also depends on the angles we take it down in terms of the outputs and the narratives we choose to focus on.
You started this talking about knocking down walls, and you've finished it with building bridges, and I see that throughout the work that you do. And last week's event was brilliant in doing exactly that. If there were any walls at the beginning, they were very quickly knocked over, and I felt a very warm coming together of people, and everybody appreciated the talk from you both, you and Ibrahim, and everything that they learned. So, and vice versa, as you say, indeed, the engagement from the people in the crowd was brilliant, and there was a mixture. Sometimes it wasn't simply a question of asking questions of the panel, but becoming sort of participants within that entire structure. So that was a very interesting development for the evening too. Vahe, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure speaking with you and playing basketball with you as well. So next time you're in town, let me know. But I hope that we can talk again on your project and how it develops whenever you have the time.
Yeah, that sounds good. Also want to say a massive thank you to you for, doing this podcast. Once I found out about it and I saw like the depth of the topics and the topics you chose, I was like, this is incredible. And I've always had it on my mind that it would be great to speak to you, because I guess not every podcaster or every host has their own different angle. And I knew your one would be like more political, more identity, more class, more. And I love that. And I said, it's a difficult conversation, but I now have done enough research to be able to speak about it to a certain extent. So I want to say thank you to you, but I also want to use the opportunity to shout out everyone in Berlin, whether that be my friends who let me stay at their house and like came to all the events, all the way through to people, the organizations that helped organize it. I want to thank you to all the Berlin gang as well. Honestly, I had such a great time. And I always give the little shout out to the Sudanese Armenian community. Sometimes I find myself being like, yeah, people were like, oh, this is your project. I'm like, no, it's not my project. It's the Sudanahye's project, the Sudanese Armenian community. I only can speak here as I am today because they've all had my back. They all send me great messages of support. They all give me information. I can message people right now and they will send me photos. They will send me voice notes. If I'm ever unclear about anything, they will all help out. So it's kind of the Sudanese Armenian community coming together to kind of create this legacy that in a way is something we're giving to Sudan and the Armenian world. So thank you to them as well.
Yeah, brilliant. And of course, we'll share all links and details in the podcast notes for people to go and view these things further and where possible also experience. Thank you again. Wish you all the best and look forward to speaking with you the next time. Take care, bye.
Thank you.
And Mike.